Forgotten melody. The last note lingered in the air of the small practice room, suspended like a confession between Fiona Walsh and the empty chair beside her. Her cello rested against her shoulder, the instrument that had been her voice when words failed her. Through the window, autumn leaves scattered across the Boston Conservatory courtyard, a perfect metaphor for how her life was about to change. "He's not coming," she whispered to herself, lowering her bow as the door remained closed. Thomas had promised to meet her here before his flight, had sworn they would figure things out together. 3 hours had passed. Her phone remained silent, except for a single text. "I'm sorry. This opportunity is once in a lifetime." Fiona placed her cello in its case with trembling hands. For 2 years, she and Thomas Reid had been inseparable, the cellist and the business student with dreams larger than their cramped apartment could hold. They had met during a university fundraiser where she performed, and he had approached her afterward, charmed by both her music and her quiet determination. "When you play," he had told her that first night, "it feels like you're telling secrets the rest of us have forgotten we knew." Those words had stayed with her through countless late nights of practice, through doubts about her talent, through the struggle of building a life in music. Thomas had been her anchor, her most devoted listener, until Singapore Capital Partners had offered him a position that promised wealth, status, and everything he'd ever wanted, everything except her. "Ms. Walsh?" Professor Harrington appeared, in the doorway, her expression softening when she saw Fiona's reddened eyes. "The hall is yours for another hour if you need it." "He chose his career," Fiona said, more to herself than to her mentor. "I should have expected it." The professor sat beside her on the bench. "When I was your age, I thought love meant sacrifice. Now I know it's about growth, sometimes together, sometimes apart." Fiona shook her head. "He didn't even fight for us. One job offer and he's gone." She pulled out her phone, showing a notification from Thomas's social media, a picture of him boarding a private jet, #new beginnings. "Channel it," Professor Harrington said simply. "Every great musician needs heartbreak. It's terrible, but it's true." That evening, Fiona returned to their, now her, apartment. Thomas's belongings were already packed into boxes labeled "Ship Later." The efficiency of his departure felt like another betrayal. On their small kitchen counter sat a letter in his neat handwriting. "Fee, I know you won't understand now, but someday you will. Some opportunities change the course of your life. I can't ask you to give up your dreams here, and I can't give up mine. Maybe someday our paths will cross again when we've both become who we're meant to be. Until then, play beautifully. The world needs your music more than I do." Thomas. Fiona crumpled the note, then smoothed it out again, unable to discard even this small piece of him. She took her cello from its case and began to play, not the refined, controlled pieces from her conservatory repertoire, but something raw and improvised, notes that wept and raged against abandonment. The following weeks blurred together. Fiona threw herself into her music with an intensity that alarmed her professors. Her playing transformed, gaining a depth that had previously eluded her. Audiences at student recitals found themselves unexpectedly moved to tears, though few knew the source of the emotion behind each note. "You're playing differently," Professor Harrington noted after a particularly powerful performance, "like you've discovered something essential." "Pain," Fiona replied simply. "I'm playing pain." By the time spring arrived, bringing with it graduation and uncertainty, Fiona had earned a reputation. Critics used words like haunting and transcendent to describe her performances. A small recording label approached her about creating an album of contemporary classical pieces. Thomas, meanwhile, appeared occasionally in financial news articles, the wunderkind American making waves in Asian markets. On the night before graduation, Fiona sat alone in the practice room where she had waited for Thomas months before. She played the piece she had composed for him, one he would never hear. As the final note faded, she made a promise to herself. Her heart might be broken, but her music never would be. Thomas Reid had walked away, but Fiona Walsh would transform her heartbreak into art that would endure long after the pain had subsided. What she couldn't know then was that life, like music, often circles back to its central theme when least expected. Solo performance 5 years transformed Fiona Walsh from a promising graduate to a name recognized in classical music circles across New England. Her debut album, Silences Between, had garnered critical acclaim for its emotional depth and technical precision. Critics wrote that listening to Fiona Walsh play was like eavesdropping on someone's most intimate thoughts, uncomfortable at times, but impossible to turn away from. On this particular evening, Fiona stood backstage at Symphony Hall, her fingers absently tracing the worn edge of her cello case. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see Boston's elite filling the seats, program booklets reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers. This wasn't her first time performing at a prestigious venue, but tonight felt different. The Boston Chamber Orchestra had commissioned her to perform a solo piece during their annual gala, a recognition that still seemed surreal. 5 minutes, Ms. Walsh, the stage manager whispered, touching her shoulder lightly. Fiona nodded, taking a deep breath. The black dress she wore was simple but elegant, her dark hair swept into a low chignon. At 30, she had grown into her features, no longer the uncertain conservatory student, but a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. Only those who knew her well could see the guardedness in her eyes, the careful distance she maintained, in relationships both professional and personal. As she waited, her phone buzzed with a text from her closest friend, Renee. Packed house. Even spotted Harrison Lloyd in the 3rd row. Break a leg. Drinks after? Harrison Lloyd, the famous composer whose work she had studied religiously. Fiona's stomach tightened. The pressure of performing was familiar now, but never entirely comfortable. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the applause washed over her like a wave. She acknowledged it with a small bow before taking her seat, adjusting her cello between her knees with practiced ease. In these moments before playing, she always experienced the same fleeting memory. Thomas, watching her from the back of a practice room, his expression a mixture of pride and something else she could never quite define. Then her bow touched the strings, and everything else disappeared. The piece she performed was her own composition, Departures, inspired by the feeling of standing in train stations and airports, watching people leave. The music began softly, questioning, before building to passages that spoke of urgency and inevitability. When she reached the central movement, her body swayed with the intensity of the notes, eyes closed as her fingers found their positions without needing sight to guide them. From the audience, Harrison Lloyd watched with growing interest. Beside him sat Olivia Winters, whose family foundation funded much of Boston's art scene. They exchanged glances as Fiona's playing transported the hall to a place of shared vulnerability. Remarkable control, Lloyd murmured. But it's the emotion that's extraordinary. Olivia nodded. I've followed her career since she graduated. There's always been something haunting in her work. I've wondered about the source. When the final notes resolved into silence, the audience remained still for 3 heartbeats before erupting into applause. Fiona opened her eyes, returning from the place her music had taken her. She rose, bowing deeply, her expression composed despite the catharsis of the performance. Backstage, after the concert concluded, Fiona carefully placed her cello in its case. Her hands, so steady during performance, trembled slightly now, with post-adrenaline fatigue. A knock at the door interrupted her routine. Ms. Walsh? A young man in an impeccably tailored suit stood in the doorway. Harrison Lloyd and Olivia Winters would like to speak with you if you have a moment. Fiona's surprise must have shown on her face because the man added, They're quite impressed. Ms. Winters in particular is interested in discussing a potential commission. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would prove monumental. Olivia Winters, elegant in her 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, explained that her foundation was sponsoring a special event at Windward Estate on the Massachusetts coast. It's a celebration of innovation and arts, bringing together leaders in technology, business, and creative fields, Olivia explained. We'd like you to be our featured performer. Harrison Lloyd added, Your composition tonight demonstrated exactly the spirit we're hoping to capture, the intersection of technical excellence and emotional authenticity. The fee would be substantial, Olivia continued, naming a figure that made Fiona blink. And the exposure invaluable. Many of our guests are significant patrons of the arts. May I ask what the occasion is? Fiona inquired, collecting herself. Olivia smiled enigmatically. A homecoming of sorts. One of our most successful expatriates is returning to establish a foundation of his own. The details are being kept relatively quiet until the announcement. Later that night, in a small wine bar near the concert hall, Fiona relayed the conversation to Renee, who squealed with appropriate enthusiasm. Windward Estate? That place is legendary. Old money, private beach, the works, and they're paying you how much? Renee shook her head in disbelief. This is huge, Fee. Fiona sipped her wine thoughtfully. It feels like a turning point. I just can't decide if that's good or bad. Renee studied her friend's face. You know, in the 5 years I've known you, you've never once told me the full story about what happened before we met, the person who inspired your music. Fiona traced the rim of her glass. Because there's nothing more to tell. He chose his path. I chose mine. And yet he's in every note you play. Renee observed gently. Fiona looked up, a flash of defensiveness in her eyes. My music is mine. Whatever inspired it initially doesn't matter anymore. But as she spoke the words, an email notification appeared on her phone. The contract from the Winters Foundation, with details about the Windward Estate event, scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Fiona opened the attachment, scanning the information until a name in the program notes caught her eye. Keynote address, Thomas Reed, CEO, Horizon Innovations. The wine glass nearly slipped from her fingers. Fee? What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost, Renee asked, concerned. Not a ghost, Fiona said quietly, turning the phone so her friend could see. Just the past coming back around. Unexpected invitation. The coastal road to Windward Estate wound like a ribbon between the Atlantic and groves of ancient oak trees. Fiona stared out the window of the hired car, her cello secured beside her, watching sunlight fracture across the water. In her lap, she held the event program she had read and reread for 3 weeks, her thumb creasing the edge where Thomas's name appeared in elegant typeface. According to my GPS, we're about 5 minutes out, ma'am, the driver informed her. Fiona nodded, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her emerald silk dress. After discovering Thomas would be at the event, she had nearly canceled. Only Renee's insistence had prevented her retreat. You can't let him derail your career, her friend had said firmly. Besides, maybe this is the universe giving you closure. Closure. The word felt inadequate for the complexity of emotions that had resurfaced. In the years since Thomas's departure, Fiona had dated occasionally, a violinist from the symphony, a literature professor, a graphic designer, but none had progressed beyond a few months. She told herself it was her dedication to music that left little room for relationships, but in quiet moments, she recognized the protective walls she had built. Windward Estate appeared suddenly around a bend, a sprawling mansion of weathered stone and gleaming windows perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Security personnel directed their vehicle through ornate iron gates and along a circular driveway where staff in formal attire waited to assist arriving guests. Ms. Walsh, a woman with a tablet, approached as Fiona stepped from the car. I'm Camille Diaz, event coordinator. We're delighted you could join us. Your cello will be taken to the performance area, and I'll show you to your suite. Suite? Fiona asked, reluctant to be separated from her instrument. Camille smiled reassuringly. Ms. Winters arranged accommodations for all featured guests. The celebration continues through tomorrow, with your performance as tonight's highlight. The interior of Windward Estate was a tasteful blend of historic architecture and modern luxury. Camille led Fiona through corridors adorned with museum-quality artwork to a wing overlooking the estate's gardens. The suite assigned to her featured a sitting room, bedroom, and private terrace with an unobstructed view of the ocean. You'll find the schedule on the desk, Camille explained. The welcome reception begins at 6 in the main hall. Your sound check is scheduled for 4:30. Alone in the suite, Fiona moved to the window, watching waves crash against the cliffs below. Her performance wasn't for hours, but her stomach already nodded with anticipation. Not for the playing, that was her sanctuary, but for the moment. She would inevitably encounter Thomas. What would he look like now? What would he say? More importantly, what would she say? The sound check provided temporary distraction. The performance space was a glass-enclosed conservatory extending from the main house, with the ocean as backdrop. As Fiona tested acoustics and adjusted lighting with the technical team, she found herself scanning each person who entered, both dreading and hoping for a familiar face. "The acoustics in here are remarkable," offered the sound engineer, a woman named Petra with vibrant, red hair. Like the room itself is an instrument, Fiona played a few measures from her prepared program, feeling the space respond to her cello. "It's perfect," she agreed, "almost too perfect." By 6 o'clock, Fiona had changed into her performance attire, a wear floor-length gown in deep burgundy that left her shoulders bare, her dark hair arranged in an intricate updo. She stood before the mirror in her suite, barely recognizing the composed woman who stared back. "You are not defined by his presence," she told her reflection. "Your music stands on its own." The welcome reception buzzed with the energy of 200 influential guests gathered in Windward's Grand Hall. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over conversations between tech entrepreneurs, financial moguls, artists, and philanthropists. Fiona accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and positioned herself near a marble column, observing the room while remaining somewhat apart from it. "Fiona Walsh," came a voice at her elbow. "Your recording of the Bach cello suites is transcendent." She turned to find Harrison Lloyd, the composer she'd met after her Boston performance. "Mr. Lloyd, thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." "Harrison, please," he insisted. "And I should be thanking you. That recording kept me company through a particularly difficult composition block." He gestured around the opulent room. "Well, quite the gathering, isn't it? The intersection of money and creativity always creates an interesting dynamic." "I'm still not entirely clear on the purpose," Fiona admitted. "Ms. Winters mentioned a homecoming and a foundation launch?" Harrison's eyes flickered with something, amusement perhaps, or caution. "Ah, you haven't heard the full story then. Thomas Reed is currently being mobbed by venture capitalists," interrupted Olivia Winters, appearing beside them in a stunning silver ensemble. "Fiona, my dear, you look wonderful. I'm so pleased you could join us." "Ms. Winters, thank you for the invitation," Fiona said, fighting to keep her voice steady at the mention of Thomas's name. "Your estate is breathtaking." "Olivia, please," the older woman corrected warmly. "And the estate belongs to the foundation, not to me personally. We use it to foster connections between visionaries." She tilted her head, studying Fiona with unexpected intensity. "Speaking of connections, I believe you and our guest of honor share some history." The directness of the question startled Fiona. "We attended university together," she managed, wondering how much Olivia knew. "Fascinating. Coincidence," Olivia remarked, though her tone suggested it might not be coincidental at all. "He specifically requested classical cello for tonight's program. When your name came up through Harrison's recommendation, it seemed providential." Before Fiona could process this revelation, the crowd shifted, creating a clear sight line across the room. And there he was, Thomas Reed, surrounded by admirers yet somehow standing apart from them. 5 years had transformed the ambitious student into a commanding presence. His features had matured, shoulders broadened beneath an impeccably tailored suit. When he smiled at something someone said, the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. As if sensing her gaze, Thomas looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment, everything between them, time, distance, choices made and unmade, collapsed into nothing. Fiona saw the shock register on his face, followed by something unreadable. He excused himself from his circle and began moving toward her with purposeful strides. I believe that's my cue to circulate, Olivia said with a knowing smile. Harrison, shall we? As they departed, leaving Fiona alone by the column, she realized her hands were trembling. She set down her champagne glass, drawing herself up to her full height as Thomas approached. 5 years of imagined conversations evaporated as he stopped before her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of his cologne, different from what he had worn in college, but somehow still familiar. Fiona, he said, her name a question and statement all at once. You're here. I'm the entertainment, she replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Had I known who the guest of honor was, I might have recommended another cellist. Thomas's expression flickered with hurt before settling into careful neutrality. Your performance is the one part of this evening I'm genuinely looking forward to. The announcement for dinner provided Fiona a reprieve from responding. As guests moved toward the dining hall, Thomas hesitated. We should talk, he said quietly. After your performance, perhaps? Fiona nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. As she followed the crowd to dinner, she realized that her hands had stopped trembling. Whatever conversation awaited her with Thomas, she would face it with the same discipline and control she brought to her music. What she couldn't control, however, was the rapid beating of her heart, playing a rhythm she had spent 5 years trying to forget. Recognition. The dinner preceding Fiona's performance blurred into a haze of polite conversation and untasted food. She was seated at a table with Harrison Lloyd, a renowned painter, a tech executive, and a philanthropist couple from Chicago. Deliberately placed, she suspected, away from Thomas, who occupied the center table with Olivia Winters and what appeared to be the event's most distinguished guests. Nervous about the performance? Asked the painter Josephine Mercer when Fiona fell silent during a discussion about art patronage. Not about playing, Fiona admitted, watching Thomas across the room. He was engaged in conversation but glanced her way every few minutes as though ensuring she hadn't disappeared. Josephine followed her gaze knowingly. Ah, history? Ancient history, Fiona replied, turning her attention back to her barely touched salmon. Nothing about the heart is ever truly ancient, Josephine said with the wisdom of her 60 years. It exists outside of time. As dessert was served, Olivia Winters rose to address the gathered guests. The room quieted immediately, a testament to her influence. Welcome to Windward's celebration of innovation, she began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the dining hall. Tonight marks the beginning of an exciting new chapter for both the Winters Foundation and for American entrepreneurship. For 5 years, we've watched one of our brightest talents reshape markets across Asia. Now Thomas Reed returns to establish the Reed Innovation Fund, dedicated to supporting young visionaries in both business and the arts. Applause rippled through the room. Thomas acknowledged it with a modest nod, his expression suggesting discomfort with the attention. Thomas's vision represents what my late husband and I always believed, that true innovation happens at the intersection of commerce and creativity, Olivia continued. After dinner, we'll gather in the conservatory where the extraordinarily talented cellist Fiona Walsh will perform, followed by Thomas's address announcing the fund's first initiatives. More applause, with many gazes shifting toward Fiona. She maintained her composure, though internally she processed Olivia's words. Thomas wasn't just attending this event, he was its centerpiece, returning to America to establish a fund supporting arts and business. The irony wasn't lost on her. As dinner concluded, guests migrated toward the conservatory. Fiona slipped away to prepare, finding her cello waiting in a small antechamber adjacent to the performance space. The instrument had been her constant companion when people had not. Running her fingers along its smooth wood provided the centering she desperately needed. 10 minutes, Ms. Walsh, a staff member informed her before closing the door. Alone, Fiona closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The program she had prepared weeks ago, selections from Bach, Dvořák, and her own compositions, now seemed inadequate for the emotional complexity of the moment. On impulse, she pulled sheet music from her folio and rearranged the order, adding a piece she had composed but never performed publicly. When she finally entered the conservatory, the space had been transformed. Chairs arranged in semicircles faced a small raised platform, with the darkened ocean visible through floor to ceiling, windows behind it. Candles and subtle lighting created an atmosphere of intimacy despite the room's size. Olivia had positioned her performance as the evening's artistic highlight, but Fiona recognized it was also intended as prelude to Thomas's announcement, emotional context for his professional triumph. She took her position on the platform, adjusting her dress before settling with her cello. The audience quieted as she raised her bow. In the front row, Olivia Winters smiled encouragingly. 3 seats away from her sat Thomas, his expression so intensely focused on Fiona that she momentarily faltered before finding her center. The first notes of Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 filled the conservatory, familiar and grounding. Fiona let the music flow through her, a conversation between composer, performer, and audience that had continued across centuries. As she played, her initial tension dissolved into the meditative state that had always been her refuge. She transitioned from Bach to Dvorak, then to her own composition, Departures, which many in the audience recognized from her recordings. Throughout, she kept her eyes either closed or focused just above the audience, avoiding direct contact with Thomas's unwavering gaze. For her final piece, the one she had added moments before, Fiona finally allowed herself to look directly at him. "This final piece is one I composed recently," she addressed the audience, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's called Recognition, and tonight will be its first public performance." The piece began softly, tentatively, with notes that questioned and searched. Unlike her earlier compositions that channeled anger or loss, this one explored something more complex, the recognition that pain transforms rather than diminishes, that absence can create its own presence. As the melody developed, it incorporated motifs from an unfinished piece she had been composing during her final days with Thomas, but resolved them differently, not with resignation, but with acknowledgement of what had been and what remained. The conservatory remained absolutely silent except for her cello, the audience collectively holding its breath. In the front row, Thomas sat motionless, his composed expression gradually giving way to naked emotion as he recognized musical phrases from their shared past. When the final notes resolved, not in dramatic conclusion but in quiet continuance, the silence held for several heartbeats before the room erupted in applause. Fiona acknowledged the standing ovation with a deep bow, carefully avoiding Thomas's eyes as she left the platform. In the antechamber, she placed her cello in its case with trembling hands, aware that her performance had communicated what words could not. The door opened behind her. "You changed the program," Thomas said quietly. Fiona turned to face him, acutely, aware they were alone for the first time in 5 years. "The original selection didn't feel right for tonight." Thomas stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. The sounds of the gathering filtered through, providing background to their suspended moment. "I'm supposed to be giving my address right now," he said, announcing the fund, outlining initiatives, playing the triumphant returning entrepreneur. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Fiona's chest ache. "But I can't walk out there and pretend your performance didn't just dismantle 5 years of careful compartmentalization. That wasn't my intention," Fiona said, though they both recognized the half-truth. "Wasn't it?" Thomas moved closer, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You incorporated themes from the piece you were working on when I left." "You recognized it," she said, surprised despite herself. "I followed your career, Fee. Every recording, every review." His voice softened. "Did you think I could walk away and simply forget?" "That's exactly what you did," Fiona replied. Old. Hurt surfacing despite her resolve. "One opportunity and you were gone. Not even a proper goodbye, just a note and empty promises about paths crossing someday." Thomas flinched at the accuracy of her recollection. "I was 23 and terrified. The Singapore offer was beyond anything I'd imagined, but accepting meant leaving everything, leaving you." He hesitated. You never answered my emails. After the first year, I stopped trying. Fiona stared at him. What emails? The only communication I received from you was your social media posts about your glamorous new life. Confusion crossed Thomas's face. I wrote to you every week for months. When you never responded, I assumed you'd moved on. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through it, and handed it to her. They're still in my sent folder. Fiona took the phone, scrolling through dozens of emails spanning months after his departure. Emails expressing regret, explaining his decision, asking about her music, her life. Emails sent to an address she had abandoned in her determination to sever all connections to their shared past. I never saw these, she whispered. I created a new email account. I couldn't bear seeing your name in my inbox. A knock at the door interrupted them. Camille Diaz's voice came through. Mr. Reed, Ms. Winters is asking about the delay. Tell her I need 5 more minutes. Thomas called back, his eyes never leaving Fiona's face. The fund I'm announcing tonight, it's not just about business innovation. Half of its resources are dedicated to supporting musicians and composers, providing them sustainable careers without compromising artistic integrity. He took a deep breath. I built it thinking of you, of what you needed when we were younger, of what I failed to understand then. Fiona handed his phone back, processing his words. You created a multi-million-dollar foundation because of regret? Not regret, Thomas corrected gently. Recognition of what matters, of what endures. He gestured toward the door. I need to go make this announcement, but afterward, would you be willing to talk? Really talk? The distant sound of the ocean filled the silence between them. Fiona thought of the years spent transforming pain into music, of the walls she had built, of the unfinished conversations that had haunted her compositions. Yes, she finally said. I think it's time we talked. As Thomas turned to leave, Fiona added, Your sister, is she here tonight? Thomas looked back, puzzled. Valerie? No, she's in London. Why do you ask? No reason, Fiona replied, a small smile touching her lips as she remembered her original misapprehension about the event. Just curious about your family. When Thomas left to deliver his address, Fiona remained in the antechamber, listening to the applause that greeted him. 5 years ago, she had vowed to transform heartbreak into art that would endure. What she hadn't anticipated was that the transformation might eventually lead back to its source, not as repetition, but as recognition of a melody that had never truly ended. Harmonic Resolution Dawn painted the Atlantic in shades of amber and rose as Fiona stood on the terrace of her suite, watching waves break against windward's cliffs. She had slept little, her mind replaying the previous evening's revelations. Thomas's unread emails, the foundation created partly in her honor, the unmistakable recognition that 5 years of separate journeys had somehow led them back to each other. After Thomas's announcement, which had received enthusiastic applause and immediate pledges of support, they had found a quiet corner of the estate's library. There, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the lingering scent of aged paper, they had talked until well past midnight. I thought success would feel different, Thomas had admitted, loosening his tie as they sat in wingback chairs before a dormant fireplace. The first few years I was so focused on proving myself that I barely noticed the emptiness. By the time I did. By the time you did, your life had momentum, Fiona had finished for him. I understand that better than you might think. They had exchanged stories, his of navigating cutthroat business environments in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo, hers of building a career in music while teaching at the conservatory. They spoke of relationships attempted and abandoned, of achievements that felt hollow without someone to share them, of the parallel lives they had constructed separately but with curious similarities. I listened to your first album on repeat, during a particularly difficult acquisition, Thomas had confessed. My team thought I was obsessed with classical music. They didn't realize I was listening to the ghost of what I'd left behind. Now, as morning light spilled across the ocean, Fiona contemplated the strange circularity of life. Last night, guests had begun departing after Thomas's announcement, with others scheduled to leave this morning. The celebration was technically over, but for Fiona and Thomas something else was just beginning, or perhaps resuming after a long intermission. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She wrapped her robe more tightly around herself before answering. "Good morning," Thomas said, holding 2 cups of coffee. He had changed from his formal attire into jeans and a simple button-down shirt, a glimpse of the less polished version she had once known. "I thought you might be awake." Fiona accepted the offered cup. "I've been watching the sunrise. It's beautiful here." "One of the reasons I chose this location for the foundation," Thomas replied, following her onto the terrace. "Inspiration seems embedded in the landscape." They stood side by side, a comfortable silence between them as they sipped their coffee. The distance that had existed last night, carefully maintained through formal attire and the weight of their separate histories, had diminished with the morning light and casual clothes. "What happens now?" Fiona finally asked, giving voice to the question that had kept her awake. Thomas turned to face her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been since their reunion. "That depends on many things. Your life is in Boston. My foundation will be based here, but I'll still have responsibilities in Asia for at least another year." "More oceans between us," Fiona observed without bitterness. "Not necessarily." Thomas set his coffee cup on the terrace railing. "The Reed Innovation Fund needs a director for its arts division. Someone who understands what musicians and composers truly need to thrive. The position would involve dividing time between here and Boston." Fiona raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job, Thomas?" "I'm offering you a partnership," he clarified. "Professional, certainly. As for personal..." He hesitated, vulnerability replacing his usual confidence. "I've learned not to presume." Before Fiona could respond, her phone chimed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen to see Renee's name and apologized to Thomas before answering. "How was it?" Renee demanded without preamble. "Did you see him? Was it awful? Are you okay?" "It was." "Unexpected," Fiona replied, aware of Thomas pretending not to listen nearby. "In good ways. I'll tell you everything when I'm back." "When will that be?" Renee asked. "The quartet needs to know if you'll be at rehearsal tomorrow." Fiona looked at Thomas, who was gazing out at the ocean, giving her privacy while remaining present. "I'm not sure yet," she answered truthfully. "I'll let you know by this evening." After ending the call, Fiona joined Thomas at the railing. "Commitments in Boston," she explained, "reality intruding." "Reality has a habit of doing that," he agreed. "It's why I've learned to incorporate it into planning rather than fighting against it." He turned to face her fully. "Fiona, I'm not asking you to upend your life. Whatever develops between us, professionally or personally, should enhance what you've built, not replace it." The consideration in his words struck her. The Thomas who had left Boston had been brilliant but sometimes careless with others' feelings in pursuit of his ambitions. This Thomas had learned to balance vision with awareness of its impact. "I have a proposal," Fiona said after a moment's thought. "But first I need to understand something. Last night you mentioned regret, but I need to know. If you could go back, would you make a different choice? Would you stay?" Thomas considered the question with appropriate gravity. "No," he finally said, watching her face carefully. "But I would handle it differently. I would have fought harder to find a compromise that didn't require choosing between you and my ambitions. I was too binary in my thinking then. Success or love, not both." His honesty, while painful, was exactly what Fiona needed to hear. "Thank you for not saying what you thought I wanted to hear." "We've had enough misunderstandings," Thomas replied. "What's your proposal?" Fiona took a deep breath. "I'm interested in the arts director position, but I need to explore it properly. Understand the responsibilities, how it would align with my performance schedule, the impact on my teaching commitments, and as for us," she gestured between them, "we're not the same people we were 5 years ago. I'd like to get to know who you've become, properly this time." "A professional evaluation period and personal reacquaintance," Thomas summarized with a hint of amusement. "Very structured." I've learned the value of clarity, Fiona replied with a small smile. Especially with you. Thomas extended his hand formally, though his eyes held warmth. I accept your terms, Ms. Walsh. Shall we say 3 months? You can observe the Foundation's operations, review our arts initiatives, maintain your Boston commitments, and decide if the position interests you. Fiona took his offered hand, the simple contact sending an unexpected current through her. And during these 3 months? We'll rediscover each other, Thomas said simply. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty. And at the end, we'll both decide what we want, professionally and personally. They sealed the agreement with a handshake that lingered slightly longer than necessary. As they released hands, a comfortable silence settled between them. Not the absence of words, but the presence of understanding. Later that morning, as Fiona packed her belongings and carefully secured her cello for the journey back to Boston, she found herself humming a new melody. Unlike the compositions born from heartbreak that had defined her early career, this one contained notes of possibility, of paths converging after long separation. When Thomas knocked to inform her that her car was ready, she opened the door with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. I've been thinking about your performance last night, he said as he helped with her luggage. The piece you called Recognition, it wasn't just about recognizing the past, was it? It was about recognizing what remains possible. Fiona smiled, impressed by his perception. Music often knows what we're feeling before we do. At the car, they exchanged contact information, a surprisingly formal gesture given their history, but one that acknowledged the fresh start they were attempting. I'll be in Boston next week to meet with potential partners for the fund, Thomas said. Perhaps dinner. Strictly professional, of course. The teasing lilt in his voice belied the statement. Strictly professional, Fiona agreed with matching irony. I know a place near the conservatory. They have terrible food but excellent acoustics. The quartet I work with plays there sometimes. Sounds perfect, Thomas replied. Then more seriously, we have time now, Fiona. That's what I didn't understand before, that some things are worth taking time for. As the car pulled away from Windward Estate, Fiona watched Thomas in the side mirror until he disappeared around a bend in the coastal road. 5 years ago, she had transformed abandonment into art, channeling pain into music that moved others. Now she faced a different challenge, creating something new from rediscovery, from recognition of paths that diverged only to converge again with greater wisdom. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn evening reminiscent of when they had first met, Fiona performed with the Boston Chamber Orchestra to a sold-out audience. In the front row sat Thomas, who had gradually become a fixture at her performances, while she had similarly integrated into the Foundation's development meetings. Their professional collaboration had proven remarkably effective, her artistic insight complementing his strategic vision. Their personal reacquaintance had evolved with deliberate care, weekly dinners becoming more frequent, conversations extending, beyond professional matters to dreams and fears, casual touches growing more natural. They had visited Windward Estate together twice more, walking its cliff-top paths while discussing programs that would support young musicians and composers. Tonight's performance concluded with a new composition, Fiona's first public piece since Recognition. Titled Harmonic Resolution, it incorporated themes from her earlier works but transformed them, creating something that acknowledged the past while embracing a future not yet written. As the final notes resonated through the hall, and the audience rose in appreciation, Fiona's eyes found Thomas's. In his expression, she recognized what her music had been saying all along, that some melodies once begun continue even through silence, that harmony sometimes requires discord to find its truest resolution, that love, like music, exists not in individual notes but in the spaces between them, in the journey from one phrase to the next. When she joined him after the performance, he greeted her with a bouquet of violets, the same flowers he had brought to her first recital years ago. The gesture, both memory and new beginning, captured perfectly what they had discovered over the previous months, that the most powerful love stories aren't those that proceed without interruption, but those that find their way back to their essential theme, transformed by the journey and richer for having endured it. Ready for our next movement? Thomas asked quietly as they left the concert hall together. Fiona linked her arm through his, her free hand still holding her cello case, the instrument that had given voice to her heart when words failed. I believe we're just getting to the good part, she replied, stepping with him into the autumn evening and whatever melody awaited them next.